Today is Saturday, March 28th. This is your virtual field trip for the week. I am at the Babylon Arch Trail outside of Leeds. So this is actually the trailhead down below me here. You can see where those cars are parked. And my family and I are here. We just scrambled up onto these rocks to get lunch when we got here, to eat our lunch. And we're just kind of exploring around right now. So you can see it's actually not, the vegetation here is fairly similar to Red Cliffs where we were last week, but there are a few differences and then a few things also that just I have not pointed out yet. So that's kind of what we'll focus on today. But overall, broadly similar kind of vegetation, sort of high elevation Mojave vegetation type. And we've also got a little riparian corridor here, just like we did last week, so you can see those bright green cottonwoods off in the distance. And so we'll just see what we see. Here's one we've seen a bunch, just to kind of review some of the things we've seen before. So here's our Mormon Tea, right, ephedra. And I want to show this because it is actually starting to make cones. So the ephedras around here will start making reproductive material in pretty large quantities in the next couple of weeks. We've also got our black brush here. Remember our Coleogyne, Ramosissima. There's that. And there's also a bunch of sand sage around here. I'm not seeing it right now at this moment. I'll show you guys another one that we have seen a bunch and I haven't pointed out. So this is another this is a small shrub. It's in the composites. This is Broom Snakeweed, and the Latin name for it is Gutierrezia cerothrae, broom snakeweed. It's a small shrub. It's like a lot of the Asteraceae shrubs. It will flower later in the season, end of summer going into fall. So it's got these small yellow Asteraceae flower heads. And this is another one that will kind of span, has a pretty wide ecological reach. So we'll find it in the Mojave, and we'll also find it up in the Great Basin. It's actually pretty common up in Cedar City area. So that's broom snakeweed. And I also wanted to show this other shrub, another Asteraceae shrub. This one is more strictly Mojave, but we've seen this one around as well, and I haven't pointed out. So this is brittle brush, and if I'm not mistaken, this is Virgin River brittle brush, which is Encelia virginensis. So getting a little closer, we can see the leaves. So we got a lot of dead leaves that have persisted on here. These are last year's leaves, this kind of silvery color, and then the new leaves just flushing out this year. And then we've also got these pretty long flowering stalks with these heads on the end of the stalks, right? And these are, again, last year's reproductive material. So when you kind of get used to how it looks, you can recognize things in the Asteraceae pretty easily based on this overall look. So kind of they leave behind this receptacle, and if you look closely, you can often see these little marks on the receptacle where the individual florets in that. So remember, in Asteraceae, what we're looking at here looks like a flower, but it's actually this capitulum or head inflorescence. And so you'll see these receptacles left behind with some bracts underneath them, right? Modified floral leaves. And you can kind of see, so it looks kind of like a dandelion head after all the little achenes have blown away. So that's so that's Virgin River brittle brush. This one you'll only find kind of around here, and that is in the Asteraceae. And right next door to where we just were, here's another Asteraceae shrub. So a lot of our woody shrubs around here are either in the Asteraceae or the Rosaceae, right? So our brittle brush, or black brush, sorry, is over here. That's Rosaceae. This is, it's called burrow brush, or sometimes it's called white Bur Sage. This is Ambrosia dumosa, and this is another thing that you'll find in the Mojave, and it can be really abundant, really numerically dominant in certain places in the Mojave Desert. We zoom in a little closer on the foliage here. You can see we've got these small light green lobed leaves. This is actually an ambrosia. If anyone has spent time like in other parts of the country, so like ambrosia, ragweed, right, is a pretty common herbaceous plant. And it's, a lot of people have a strong allergic reaction to it. It's actually wind pollinated, so it produces, ambrosia ragweed produces lots of pollen, and a lot of people have pretty severe allergic reactions to it. So burro brush, or white Bur Sage, this is Ambrosia dumosa, so it's related to ragweed. It's in the same genus. And again, Asteraceae. No flowers yet, but when the flowers come out, you can see they come out on from last year's material, right? They come out on these little racemes of flowering heads, and they're really small and inconspicuous, so they don't have showy petals or anything because they're wind pollinated, just like ragweed is. And then the other thing is that the plant is dioecious, so you have separate male and female plants. And the leaves, if you crush them, I'm sniffing it right now, another thing you won't get like with the virtual experience, but the leaves are, they have a pleasant smell to them when you crush them. It's kind of almost like a minty smell. And so that is white Bur Sage or burro brush. So you want to tell me what you found, Bobo? No? Okay.
I don't want everyone to know my name.
Okay, alright, I'll cut you out, right, in the final production. So my boys found two new things right together. So these are both really, really cool. It's hard to decide what to talk about first. I think I'll talk about the paintbrush first. So these red flowering heads here. So these are Indian paintbrush, and this species is desert paintbrush, or Castanea cremosa. So this is another one you'll find in the Mojave. You'll find it up at our elevation as well. And a couple of interesting things about this plant. One is that it's a parasite. So the foliage actually does do photosynthesis. So they have chlorophyll and they do the normal photosynthetic process. The way that it's parasitic is that the roots tap into the roots of neighboring plants, and draw off water and nutrients from the roots of the neighbors. Okay, so this kind of parasitism, we call it it's a hemiparasitic plant, which means like half, right? So hemi, like hemisphere, right? Half of the globe. Versus things that are entirely parasitic, so they rely on their host for everything, for water, nutrients, carbohydrates, everything. We would call those holoparasites, right? So holo meaning whole. So that's interesting. So, and this is in the family Orobanchaceae, which is a family of parasitic plants, and they're closely related to things that were traditionally placed in the figwort family, like penstemons. And they share a lot of characteristics with penstemons, like they're asterid, so they have fused petals and things like that, and two carpels. They're very, very similar overall, but everything in this group is actually parasitic in the Orobanchaceae. Another thing that's interesting about paintbrush in general is that when you look at the flowers, the red color that you're seeing there is actually mostly coming from bracts, right? So remember we talked about how a bract is just any leaf associated kind of closely to a flower. So that, you can see here, that's all one bract that I've got there with 5 lobes on it. So that's the bract sitting right below or subtending this flower here. You can see this flower. So we're looking at the corolla of petals, which is mostly green and just red right at the tips. And then you can see the style and stigma sticking up out of the top there. So we'll see this sometimes where, usually it's the petals that do the job of attracting pollinators, but sometimes, there's no set law that it has to be that way, and some plants will attract pollinators using something else, often with bracts. So another example of that would be poinsettias, so the plant that we all see a lot of at Christmas time. So that red color is actually, those are bracts. So the flowers themselves are actually really teeny tiny little flowers in little clusters, kind of like a sunflower actually, in the sense that it's actually what looks like a flower and functions like a flower as an inflorescence. So that's a cyatheum, and then what actually attracts pollinators are these, the red color on a poinsettia are these modified bracts that sit below the cyatheum. Okay, so that is Castanea cremosa, desert paintbrush. And then probably its host actually is this shrub that it's growing underneath. So this is actually something in the mint family. We haven't really encountered this family in sort of our native environment here yet. So this is desert sage, Salvia dorii. And salvias are actually, when we talk about sagebrush is a composite. So, but this is true sage. I mean, this is related to culinary sage, right? Salvias are true sages. And so this is a native version of that culinary sage. And like a lot of things in the mint family, if you take a leaf, if you crush and smell the foliage, it's got a nice minty smell. You want to smell it? And yeah, let me get one for you. Here you go. Okay. So it's got this nice, pleasant, minty odor to it, and I believe you could use these to cook with if you wanted. It's, most sages are edible. And then other characteristics of the mint family. So the leaves are opposite, right? So we've got our opposite decussate phyllotaxy. You can see that hopefully pretty well there, right? These pairs of opposite leaves. And then, yeah, I'll take it. Thanks. The leaves are simple in the mint family, so not compound. And then the stems are often squared off. So if you look at a mint in cross section, like in anatomy or something, you can really see that the stems are oftentimes pretty square. Not all mints do that, but many of them do, especially lower down. They get more kind of squared off with age. And then what else about this plant? So the flowers are not quite there yet. You can just see the flowers kind of in bud. The flowers, when they come out, they are, so these are asterids. They have fused petals, and they're zygomorphic, right, or bilaterally symmetric flowers across the board in the mint family. And the way that the flowers are arranged, so the flowers are usually kind of white and purple, so they'll often be like white speckled with purple, but they're always some kind of variant of this white, pink, blue, purple color scheme. And commonly the flowers are arranged in these kind of whorls. So see how there's a whorl of flower buds here, and then you'll have these kind of distinct levels. So it's kind of like, makes me think of like a pagoda in like Chinese architecture or something like that, where you've got a whorl of flowers here, and then another one up here, another one above. So kind of these repeating whorls at different levels of flowers. So love this plant. This is one of my favorite ones in our area of kind of our native flora. We have them growing in our yard. So they're from the Mojave, but you actually will find them at Cedar City elevation as well. So that's Salvia dorii, desert sage, or Doors sage, or purple sage. So right after I shut off the camera, I looked a little bit better, and I realized there's actually, so here's just a couple of flowers that have started to open up. So they're not completely open here, but let me zoom in as much as I can. Let's try to get a good look at this thing. It's not fully open, but you can kind of see that it's like, that's the front face of the flower when it opens up a little more. Let's see here. Here's another desert paintbrush, and I just wanted to quickly show you. So we have fruits from last year here. So you can see they're a little worse for the wear, but you can see they're dried capsule fruits. So remember, a capsule is a fruit, a dry fruit that splits open to dehisce and release the seeds. So there's that capsule fruit. Remember when we looked at that penstemon fruit when we were at Hellhole? This looks a lot like that, right? You can tell there's two carpels because this is an asterid. And there you go. All right, here is a shrub that we've actually seen. It's very common at our sites in the Mojave. I've seen it in every field trip in the Mojave that I've done this year. But it's kind of a late bloomer. It's late to get started. So I haven't pointed it out just because up until now it hasn't even really started leafing out. But this is a good time to talk about it because this is in the Phacelia, which we are basically just started talking about in our lecture on Friday. So this is indigo bush. It's Fremont's indigo bush. The Latin name is Sorothamnus fremontii, and it's not going to be flowering for probably another, I don't know, month maybe. But when it does flower, it's a remarkable plant. Like indigo bush, it's called that because the flowers are this deep blue, kind of blue indigo color. It's a very, very attractive plant, like when it gets going, when it's flowering. So we can see there are some flowers on this one here from last year that never really took off. So that's what these are, you know, so that's till it really starts to flower. That's the best we can do in terms of flowers right now. You can see also the leaves here. So Phacelia, right? The leaves are most commonly in this family. If I can get it to focus in the right place, come on. There we go. So I don't know how you can see it there, but the leaves are pinnately compound. Once pinnately compound. This is in the Phaboideae group. It has those very characteristic pea flowers with the banner, 2 wing and 2 keel petals. And then the pinnately compound leaves, and typically in the Fabaceae, if you crush the leaves, you get kind of a bean smell to them. And I don't see any fruits. The fruit would be a legume like you would see across the family. So this is Fremont's indigo bush, Sorothamnus fremontii.
I just must get down here.
Okay, here's another composite or sunflower family. This is desert marigold, Baliya multiradiata. This is another one that is really widespread in the Mojave, and we've seen it, or I've seen it before on previous field trips. But again, it's kind of just getting going here. So here's one, so you can see it is an herbaceous. It's a perennial plant. It'll come back and live for a few years, but it is herbaceous. No real significant woody growth. Here are the leaves. So these, like a lot of desert plants, the leaves are kind of covered in trichomes and hairs that are basically reflecting excess light and helping the plant to stay cool in a hot desert environment, right? And so we can see very lobed leaves here, and it's a composite. So the flowers are aggregated into these capitulum inflorescences, and so you can see, looking at that, all those little dots each represent one single flower. We've got a bunch of bracts around the outside. And there's one over here that's actually opened up. So I don't know why I'm showing you that one. I should show you this one. This is the good stuff here. Oh, a little flower, a little spider on the top of it that just jumped off. So there's that spider who's hanging out. Sorry, Mr. Spider. And so just looking at that, so you can see, right? So we haven't really talked about the structure of Asteraceae flowers quite yet. But, you know, you've got all these individual flowers inside there. They mature from the outside in, so you can see the ones toward the outside of, where to go? There we go. So the flowers, or we call them florets in this group, toward the outside. So you can see each one of those basically has its own little corolla, little fused corolla, right? Asterids have fused corollas. So those 5 petals of that flower are fused together into a little tube. And then what's happening there is the anthers are also, the 5 anthers are also fused together. And the style and stigma of the carpel, they grow up through the anthers. And it's really funky. It's called secondary pollen presentation. The anthers actually dehisce their pollen onto the stigmatic surface, and the stigma is not mature yet, so it doesn't get fertilized or it doesn't get pollinated, but the stigma opens up and presents the pollen to pollinators that visit the capitulum. So that's called secondary pollen presentation, and that's basically what the Asteraceae do. Super weird. And then later, once the pollen's been picked up, then later the stigma on that floret will mature and be receptive. So I don't know why they do it that way. They just do. And then you'll see there's actually 2 kinds of florets here. There are the ones more towards the center part of the flower. Those are called disc florets, where the petals are just fused into a small little tube that is actually radially symmetrical. And then on the edge, you've got what's called ray florets, or ray flowers, that in these ones, the corolla, it's still fused, but it grows out as kind of one petal-like structure. So that's what makes these quote-unquote petals on the edge of the capitulum. Those are the corollas, the petals of the ray florets, just these florets that are just on the very margins of the flower. So, and then underneath the bracts that function kind of like sepals, if we sort of analogize this thing to a single flower, those bracts that are kind of functioning like sepals, those are called phyllaries. And that's kind of the basic setup in the Asteraceae family. And we can see this one here is growing underneath a nurse shrub, which is pretty common in the desert too, for seedlings to germinate underneath something bigger, because it provides kind of a sheltered, somewhat shaded, somewhat cooler environment to get started in life.
Yeah, go check that other one. What is it?
So speaking of growing in the shade of nurse shrubs, so here we've got an ephedra and a blackbrush. And growing down underneath here, we've got this little wildflower, little sweet thing. This is Fremonts Phacelia, and it's Phacelia fremontii. And this is the first we've seen of the family Boraginaceae, the forget-me-not family, which is actually pretty well represented in our area. And it's one of the groups that's actually probably has more representation in the Great Basin than in the Mojave. So Boraginaceae, so look at the petals there. You can see you've got 5 petals. If we look at this flower from the side, those petals are united into a tube, right? So what would you guess, like which major group of, it's a eudicot. So if you guessed asterid, you would be correct. It's an asterid, 5 petals fused into a tube. The leaves down here are lobed, or they're verging on compound. I don't know if you would technically consider those to be compound or lobed, but so this is a little annual. Most things in the Boraginaceae, ways to recognize them. One of them is that they frequently have this kind of a floral tube with the blue to purple coloration, sometimes yellow, but often the throat of the tube, the inner part, is a different color. Not always, but oftentimes it'll be white or yellow in the throat and different colors on the petals. So that's one clue. Another thing for the Boraginaceae that we're not really seeing here in this plant super well, you can kind of see it if you look underneath the flower here. Get it into focus. It's got this what's called a scorpioid cyme. Do you remember we talked about inflorescence structures in class the other day? So a cyme is an inflorescence where the main stalk terminates in a flower, and then the inflorescence branch is continued by an axillary branch, basically an axillary bud. as opposed to like a raceme or a spike or panicle where there's kind of one main branch that just keeps going and doesn't really terminate, right? It's more indeterminate. This is a determinate inflorescence where basically each flower terminates that particular shoot segment, and then the inflorescence continues with another bud, kind of a lateral bud. And we talked about a dicasium where it does that on both sides, right? This is an example of a monocasial cyme where it only continues to one side. And so you actually get this, I don't know how well you can see it here, but you'll get this kind of a spiraling pattern. So this would be called a scorpioid cyme, where it curls under like a scorpion's tail or something like that. Another good characteristic for the Boraginaceae, which we don't really see in this particular species, but is that they're often covered in simple hairs, like these simple kind of pointy needle-like hairs. So this one has these little hairs on it, but they're not very prominent compared to a lot of other Boraginaceae that we'll see in our area. So that's Fremonts Phacelia, Phacelia fremontii. Here's another good shrub to know. Another one you'll find in both the Mojave and commonly in the Great Basin as well. This is skunk bush sumac, which is Rhus aromatica variety trilobata. So skunk bush sumac, it's actually in the same family as poison oak and poison ivy. And the leaves look broadly similar to a poison oak or a poison ivy. So you probably have heard like leaves of 3 leave it be as kind of a way to recognize poison ivy. And we don't have poison ivy in our area, right? But this one's actually interesting, this species, skunk bush sumac, because you have a lot of variation in the leaf lobing and simple versus compound leaves. So the variety name trilobata kind of tells you that it's in 3s, and frequently, so this particular shrub here, most of the leaves I'm seeing are simple leaves with kind of, this sort of broadly lobed into kind of 3 lobes here. But oftentimes on this species, what we'll see is, here's some more, we will see that these sort of bottom lobes are actually separate as their own leaflets. Sometimes you'll find that variation on the same plant, but this one I'm looking at right now looks like they're pretty much all simple leaves. So it's related to poison oak, poison ivy. A lot of things in this family have these oils on the leaves that will give you a rash if you touch them. Fortunately, this one does not, or not at least in significant enough levels to cause irritation in most people. The family is called Anacardiaceae. Other things in the family include, interestingly enough, mangoes and cashews, pistachios. And people that are really sensitive to the oils will actually be allergic even to mangoes. Poor souls, because mangoes are good. So skunk bush sumac. So look for, this variation in either, these leaves being either simple or ternately, divided. And then the flowers, so I don't see flowers on this shrub. They come out usually before the leaves, and they're small and yellow. And when they mature into fruit, so the fruit is what's called a drupe, which is like a berry-like fruit, so it's fleshy, but with a bony layer on the inside of the fruit surrounding the seed. Think of like an apricot or a peach or a cherry. Those are drupes as well. So that's what that fruit type, what that means is just like it's a berry, but it's not a berry because it has that bony covering of the seed. Technically that layer is called the endocarp, the inner part of the ovary wall. And that fruit though, it's pretty tart, like it's edible. You can pick them off of the plant and eat them, and they're tart, they're acidic. And settlers actually, so one of the other common names besides skunk bush sumac is sometimes called lemonade berry bush, because you can use the fruits, those drupes, mix them, make them into a drink, mix them with some sugar, and you've got kind of a lemonade substitute for the late summer when the fruits come out. So that's skunk bush sumac. Oh, and the name skunk bush sumac, so the leaves, if you crush them and smell them, they're kind of funky smelling. So kind of a fetid smell to them. Just wanted to point this one out. We talked about it last time. This is desert trumpet, Eriogonum inflatum. But it's just, I wanted to point out because there's tons of them here. I don't know if you can see. They're basically all around this little rocky hillside, all going up these rocks here. Tons and tons of them.
Yeah, this way would be easier.
Here's the view from the top of this
Can we do this
little mesa
one?
that we've been kind of
Can we do this
scrambling
this
up.
one?
It's a cool habitat. You can do that one. Here's another Eriogonum, another buckwheat. So we can see again this kind of quasi-umbellate inflorescence, right? It's like an umbel, but it's very sort of imbalanced. So there's usually kind of one branch of the umbel that's sort of grows out longer than the others, and so it's not really a true umbel, but that sort of imbalanced umbel is a very Eriogonum kind of a characteristic. So Eriogonum, so sometimes they can be shrubby, not frequently, but this one is pretty shrubby. This is crisp leaf buckwheat, Eriogonum corymbosum. And see these, I accidentally stopped the video, the leaves sort of flushing out in little clusters like that, and they got this, you know, like so many things in the desert, just with trichomes on the surface that give it kind of like this whitish fuzzy sheen that is reflecting excess sunlight away from the plant. So just another Eriogonum, kind of a fun one. Eriogonum corymbosum. Is it corymbosum? It's crisp leaf buckwheat. Actually, I better check that ID. Yeah, I gotta check that. So we're kind of right on this ridge. It's just fun to notice how things change. Right, so over on this side we've got lots of blackbrush and ephedra and these desert trumpets. And then over here I'm seeing tons of desert almond and this Eriogonum, whatever it is that I was just talking about. There's still blackbrush down there, but so it's just you get a different composition from one side, you know, just the conditions, right? The direction that they're being hit by the sun and whatever else, wind patterns, whatever it might be. I haven't talked really about grasses very much yet, if at all. I don't know grasses all that well, but there are a few that I know just by sight. And there's quite a bit of this one around, so I'm going to talk about this one. This is Hilaria jamesii, also known as Etta Grass. And we can recognize it. It's got kind of like one killer thing that just makes it so that even someone who doesn't know grasses like me can recognize it. And that is, well, overall, first of all, the way it grows is a bunch grass, right? Like a lot of our native grasses, they grow in clumps. You see there's tons of it over here on this hill, this little hummock. It's a perennial, so you'll often see the leaves from last year persisting among the new green leaves, right? And so they kind of curl around, so they've got this kind of this characteristic look to them. But the thing that's really distinctive and allows you to, for me, like the killer characteristic is if you see inflorescences from last year. Let me see if I can get this on the camera here. So last year's inflorescences, let me zoom in here. The stalk has this really characteristic zigzag shape to it. Do you see that there? So I don't know if there's very many things that do that, very many grasses. So that's Hilaria jamesii. And then when it's in flower, which it'll be later in the summer, the inflorescences are really distinctive as well. The little grass florets, they're kind of fuzzy and they're kind of this mix of white and green, and they're just kind of easy to tell. But if you have last year's material, if you see a bunch grass and it's got this zigzag stalk, that's Etta Grass, Hilaria jamesii. So speaking of Phacelia, we've got a little clump all along the trail here of Astragalus plants. So Astragalus are milk vetches, and again, like Astragalus is one of our big three genera, along with Penstemon and Eriogonum, in terms of diversity. There are lots of Astragalus species in our area, and oftentimes the characteristics to tell them apart are pretty subtle unless you're really specializing in the group. It's, you know, so I'm not an expert in Astragalus, so I'm just going to leave this at Astragalus, and maybe I can try to figure out what it is. But it's like you have to figure out if the hairs are like T-shaped or simple, right? And like all these different, sometimes you need the fruits to be able to tell for sure what it is you're looking at. So, but the overall look is very distinctive and very difficult to confuse with other things. There's one other genus, Oxytropis locoweeds, which is pretty similar to Astragalus, but there are way fewer Oxytropis around here. So if you see a plant that kind of like a low-growing perennial, sometimes like almost shrubby, some of them get a little bit shrubby, but most of them kind of this really low-growing rosette form with these pea flowers and, you know, pea family type leaves, then you can be pretty sure that's Astragalus. So let's take a closer look at how we know, right? So in the pea family, the leaves, again, typically pinnately compound, right? So you have some things like lupins that are palmately compound, but most of them are pinnately compound. And this is odd pinnate, right? So you got paired leaflets until the last one, and then the last one is kind of the odd man out. So it's odd pinnate. If we crush the leaves, we get kind of a bean. Yeah, kind of a distinct bean odor. Do you smell that? The kind of bean smell there, bud? Yeah. And then at the base of the leaves, so you can see these stipules, right? So zoom in, see those stipules there? Pretty prominent, oftentimes in Fabaceae. So those are the actual outgrowths of the leaf. Okay. The other characteristic that we have in plants in the Faboideae group, right, that subfamily of the Fabaceae pea family, is the flowers. They're just really, really characteristic. So I'm going to go ahead and take one of these flowers and we'll kind of take it apart step by step here to show. So one thing you'll see is that the sepals are actually fused together. So there are 5 sepals and they're fused to make this tube, which is interesting because the petals themselves are actually free. So I'm going to go ahead and peel off those sepals here. Get that. There we go. Okay. And then the 5 petals, you've got 5 free petals, and we've got a zygomorphic or bilaterally symmetric flower. And the arrangement in this subfamily is you have the top petal, which is this large petal that's kind of dwarfing the whole rest of the flower. This is called the banner petal. Okay, so that's the banner petal. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. And then to the side we've got, I'm going to set that here. To the side we've got the 2 wing petals, right? So there's one of the wing petals. It's kind of a clawed petal there on a little stalk. And then the wing petal on the opposite side. And then on the bottom, and sort of cupping the androecium and gynoecium, we've got the keel petals. And there's actually 2 petals here, but they're fused together, at least at their tip. So there's actually 2 petals there you can see, but they're fused together. They're called the keel petal again, because that's kind of like the keel of a boat, is the bottom part of a boat, right? That ridge. And then in the middle, what we're left with is we've got 10 stamens, and there are actually 9 stamens that are fused together, so the filaments are all fused into one structure. And then you've got this one, the 10th stamen is just this one odd free stamen, which is so weird. So that 10th stamen was sitting up here, and it's all separate now, but it was kind of sitting above like that. So there was that 10th, and then there's 9 stamens here. And then the filaments that are fused together, they sort of are wrapped around the gynoecium. So you've got the single carpel in there, right? So inside the middle, there's that one carpel with the style and stigma there, kind of sitting inside those filaments. It's a pretty funky arrangement, and that's kind of the most common setup in the Faboideae group, right? The pea subfamily. Okay. Spot the lizard. See it on that little rock? So I wasn't going to talk about the lizard though. So underneath this creosote, we've got this other shrub that's really, really fun and cool. Oh, there's two lizards. See them down there? There's two of them just sitting still, but I'm not going to notice them. So look at this spiny little shrub under here. This is actually in the same family as tomatoes and nightshade and eggplants and stuff like that. So that's Solanaceae. This plant is Lycium andersonii, or Anderson's boxthorn. I just think I love like looking at things like this, like our desert almond, that kind of show in these familiar plants, like how they, when they get into the desert, they kind of do similar things, right? Like broadly, this doesn't look that different from a desert almond. We can know it by the flowers. So here's a flower. Zoom in. See that flower? So we have got 4 petals in this case. Usually there's 5 in this family, but there are 4 petals and they're fused into a corolla tube, right? So see that there? Very cool. And then, but overall the leaves, like it's not really, it's just sort of a deserty shrub. We've got leaves flushing in short shoots, which we've seen, you know, in these little bundles, which is just so common in desert plants. The leaves are a little bit more succulent, a little water storing, so they're kind of thick on this one. There's another boxthorn in our area called pallid boxthorn, Lycium pallida. That is, the leaves aren't quite as, they're a little bigger and they're not quite as succulent. So yeah, Solanaceae, Lycium andersonii, and when these flowers are pollinated, when they mature, they'll form little berry-like fruits. They look like little tiny tomatoes, kind of. Not berry-like, they are berries. Just like a tomato is a berry. All right. Here's our desert almond, our Fremonts indigo bush. Here's another shrub that we haven't talked about yet. This is a fun one. It's in a family that does not usually grow really shrubby like this. So this is kind of unusual for its group. So when we get in a little closer, the flowers, see how we've got in a flower, there's 4 petals there. They're actually notched a little bit, and I don't know if you can see there's 6 stamens there. 4 of them are long and 2 of them are short. So this is in the mustard family, and this is Fremont's pepperweed, Lepidium fremontii, and it's one of the few mustards in our area that gets kind of shrubby like this. You'll notice it, I notice it quite a bit. There's a patch of them on the way down to St. George on I-15. You'll see them, these shrubs, when they're in full flower, they'll be almost white all over. So you can kind of spot it from the road. But it's got all the classic mustard family characteristics, the 4 petals and in a cross shape, and the 6 stamens. The leaves in this one are really very linear, right? Just kind of linear thread-like leaves. So that's Fremont's pepperweed. So last week at Red Cliffs, there was a shrub in the Chenopodiaceae, the spinach family, 4-winged saltbush, and I accidentally called it Atriplex, so I got to make sure I get this right, because I always, like I said, I have a wire crossed in my brain for the names of these plants. I know the common names, but the Latin names I always mix up. So 4-winged saltbush is Atriplex canescens, and canescens means silvery. This one is the other one, Atriplex convertifolia. Convertifolia means leaves all squished together. All right, so this is Atriplex convertifolia, or shad scale, and they're pretty similar. I mean, you can tell they're closely related. They both, the branches form kind of these thorny tips, right? And that's, again, that's not unusual in deserty shrubs. The leaves are shorter and more oval in this one. And they also, I don't know how well it's picking up, But they have this kind of like crystally looking appearance. Let me see if I can find one. You see that on there? It's almost kind of like they kind of shine in this kind of crystally, you know, kind of way. So no flowers yet. We can see flower buds just getting started here. Where's my hand? There we go. So those are the flower buds in there. Flowers typically in this family are small and inconspicuous and kind of greenish or kind of greenish pink. So that's shad scale. And in some parts of the shad scale is ecologically pretty dominant, but I haven't found too many areas around here where you can see a lot of it. Up at Parowan Gap is one good spot. And interestingly here, they seem to be kind of sticking to this little riparian zone, this little stream coming through here, which just seems odd. That's where I'm finding them today. And there's four-winged saltbush up here, up above, but it's kind of more in this upland type of a zone. So we got to the top of this little embankment, and all along here in kind of this open rocky area, you see these little yellow blossoms all over. So this is a little annual composite, little thing in the sunflower family. This is Wallace's woolly daisy. So you can see, looking closer, right? You see how those are little composite flowers. Not sure how well that's showing up because of the glare, but let me find a different one. There we go. So you see how those little composite flower structure, right? A bunch of little tiny flowers in there. So just a little annual yellow composite. There's a couple of different woolly daisies in the Mojave. There's a yellow one, that's Wallace's woolly daisy. So that's this one, Areophyllum Wallacei. And then Areophyllum, I believe, means fuzzy-leaved. Areo means fuzzy, I think. I'll have to check that. And then there's another one that has white petals. That is, oh boy, Areophyllum lanuginosum. I think it's just called white woolly daisy. Anyway, so you see those around. They're just kind of fun. Just these little guys. Here's our shad scale with flowers open. So I wanted to show this one. Also, I didn't mention before about the shad scale, the leaves, kind of that glimmering, shining effect on the leaves. I believe that is from enlarged water storing cells in the epidermis of the leaf. So here they are with the flowers, and so a lot of flowers in this family in the Chenopodiaceae they tend to be pretty inconspicuous and not really showy. They are insect pollinated as far as I know, but they don't go in big for like really colorful flowers. They're small, they're often kind of greenish, or these are sort of a pale yellowish color with the stamens sticking out pretty far. They look a lot actually like a wind pollinated type of flower to me, but I'm gonna have to check that. All right, so there's your flowers for shad scale. Here is an Apiaceae. See those divided parsley-like leaves, and the inflorescence is an umbel, a compound umbel. This is a Cymopterus, and it's actually been moved into the genus Vesper, so I correct myself. Lots of tiny little purple flowers, and I believe this is Vesper purpureus, which means purplish.